Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed our morning sessions and that you're ready now for a very busy afternoon. We have 2 more panel sessions followed by a live keynote from our second international speaker, which will close out the day from Paris. Before we get into the session, may I once again take a moment to acknowledge and to thank our 2 official conference partners, the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning and Infrastructure Australia. A reminder to all of you that once again we'll be accepting questions throughout this and the subsequent sessions. Just use the live Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That will open up a panel that you can type your questions into. I encourage you to be thinking of questions and typing those in during the presentation in just a moment. You also have the option of selecting the discussion forum again. And that's a way that you can chat with fellow delegates and comment on the presentations and discussions that are taking place. Don't use either of these functions, though, if you have any technical issues. If you do have technical issues to do with the program and the software and accessing things or hearing things, then in that case, please use the red live support icon, which you'll see in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And if you click on that, then our team at the back of house will do their best to assist you. Now, our next session today is social infrastructure delivery in a post-coronavirus context. In this session, we will discuss the delivery of healthcare, education, and the many other vital social services that actually changed overnight when COVID-19 first hit. And we're all aware that this has and may continue to reshape demand for and the delivery of social infrastructure over months and years to come. I'm looking forward to hearing from the speakers before we then open up to audience Q&A session, which I'll moderate. So with that, I'm very pleased now to welcome the panel of speakers that we have for today's next session. We will begin with a research presentation, and that is from Dr. Somwrita Sarkar from the University of Sydney. Somwrita is the lead author of a recently published Uhuru project, which is called New Housing Supply, Population Growth and Access to Social Infrastructure. This research is now live on the Uhuru website, where you can download the report, a policy evidence summary, and also a standalone executive summary relating to that project. And I'm told actually that you can access the report through the portal today at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to have a look at that research, please do. And of course, go to the Uhuru website and download it to look at your leisure. Once Somwrita has presented on her research, we will then hear from our other panelists. And for that, we welcome Tanya Steinbeck. Tanya is the CEO of UDIA WA. Tanya has a wealth of property development industry experience in Western Australia in both the private and the government sectors. She's worked in various communications, project and management roles over her 20-year career. We will also welcome Alex Rhodes. Alex is the Executive Director for Regional Victoria at the Victorian Planning Authority. At the VPA, Alex is responsible for unlocking planning systems to drive investment, to create new suburbs and deliver transformational city building projects. Alex has held leadership roles at the Property Council, at the Western Australian Housing Authority, the Victorian Arts Centre, the Australian Cooperative Research Centre for Renewable Energy, and Creative Partnerships Australia. Please feel free to read more in-depth biographies of all of our panellists on the official conference website. And with that now, I invite Dr. Somwrita Sarkar to take the stage and present her research to us from Sydney. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom. This project was very, very interesting in the way that it was positioned in time. And by that, I mean that when we received news of this project having been funded, this was pre-COVID. COVID hadn't, there was no COVID on the scene at all. And by the time we had launched into the project, into the work, it was very much, moving into the heart of COVID. So at the time that the project was funded, we were looking at these questions of, greenfield developments, rapidly growing cities, increasing population, what's going to happen to the fringes of our major capital cities. And the set of research questions that we had in mind completely kind of transformed by the time we ended this project, because by that time COVID had set in, and things like migration had closed down. But at the same time, uh, the context in which we were operating had suddenly changed to how important it is to access social infrastructure in lockdown conditions in the suburbs and the peripheries and the fringe regions of our capital cities. So even though the context, the urban context completely changed, what was very key and what was kind of central was this realization that how important is this topic is in the sense of, accessibility to social infrastructure remains a key, crucial, essential part of urban development, whether we are looking at, normal trends, scenarios, or whether we are looking at shock or extreme event kind of scenarios. Now, I'm sure that COVID is not the first shock and extreme event to hit our cities, and it won't be the last. And so I thought that possibly a good position to take would be to relate accessibility to social infrastructure and how important it is to this whole question of urban resilience, that what makes cities resilient. And one of the key things that makes our cities resilient is whether or not every citizen can have a good quality of life because they have reasonably good access to social infrastructure. And so, with that little background into the project, I launch into the presentation. We would have all seen the numerous news articles that actually related these two issues, that how important equitable access to social infrastructure is during COVID, in normal times as well, but especially during COVID, to enable social and physical and mental health, well-being. And of course, when one person is happy and every person in the community is happy, we have cohesive and vibrant communities. At the same time, there was this mounting realization that when shocks hit, when things like COVID hit, the poor and the vulnerable suffer the most. So throughout, we'll again have numerous news articles which show that the disadvantaged areas of our cities, the poorer areas, the lower income and the moderate income areas, were the hardest hit by COVID. And what is fairly critical in this is this whole question of accessibility to social infrastructure, because people's lives changed, people's work patterns changed, the way they access transit changed. And I think it's fairly clear and evident that if I am rich and I have the means and resources, I can choose not to take the train and I can jump into my car. But if I'm a family, if I'm a low income worker, say even in a critical or an essential service sector, and I have a family of four, and me and my partner both work, then it's not as easy for all of us to jump into a car. And maybe like large sections of the population still needed to go to work, they still could not work from home, their children still needed to access, child cares. So I think this was a very serious picture of what brought out how important uh, a resilient social infrastructure system is for people, especially when things like COVID hit. So, so how do we define social infrastructure? We go by, say, the Infrastructure Australia definition, which is a pretty good one. We define social infrastructure as the facilities, spaces, services, and networks that support the quality of life and well-being of our communities. It helps us to be happy, safe, and healthy, to learn and to enjoy life. The network of social infrastructure contributes to social identity, inclusion, and cohesion, and is used by all Australians at some point in their lives, often on a daily basis. And that kind of summarizes it really well, because we are talking about transit infrastructure, the bus stop next to my home, the school, the childcare, the primary school as well as the secondary school, the hospital, the primary healthcare center, the shop next to my house, the big retail centers, the groceries that we do every day, like literally every aspect of our lives, our needs and requirements, every moment is linked to this vast network of services and spaces and facilities that we need to access. So we also know that longer term, like, we will move out of COVID, things will get back to normal. In all possibility, big shocks have hit big cities, and world history shows us that big cities have not died out. They are very resilient in the face of any big shocks and changes. So the longer term policy vision is also in line with saying that we do want 30-minute cities. We do want 20-minute neighborhoods. So, we see the Greater Sydney Commission plan here for 30-minute cities, and we see the Melbourne plan here, which says we should aim for 20-minute neighborhoods. And the basic idea is, again, that it is all about living locally. We give people the ability and the chance to meet most of their daily needs. We give them all the opportunities within 20 or 30 minutes, preferably through transit, and preferably through environmentally sustainable ways and means, right? So we see that it's not just a short-term question, it's also a question for strategic long-term planning, this whole question of accessibility to social infrastructure. And so at the start of the project, we were kind of thinking that, yes, there are these big plans, and obviously this is the long-term vision, and then COVID hits, and the pandemic hits, and we received reports of what people are going through and how hard it is for everybody to just go about their daily lives in terms of accessing what they need. So the first question was empirical. What is the data actually telling us? What is actually happening out there on the ground? And so let's just turn this into a couple of small tests. If I was to ask you the question, how many primary schools can you access? Suppose you are in the centroid of a mesh block, that's where you live. So mesh blocks are these tiny little statistically defined geographical areas by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, where that's the tiniest unit from where all of our census information is collected. And if I was standing in the center of a mesh blocks, the centroid, how many primary schools can I access within, say, 10 or 20 minutes of walking distance, right? And I could flip the question, and I could put the primary school at the center, and then say how many usual residents, how many students can a school access within 10 or 20 minutes of walking distance. So these are two flipped accessibility questions. And let's just see some pictures on what the data shows us. Right, so these are the blue dots. I'm not sure the color scheme is entirely clearly visible, but there are a number of blue dots there which show the location of all of the primary and secondary public and private schools across Sydney. And the little regions around the lighter shaded areas show the 10-minute walk accessibility to these schools. So everybody who falls in that light area would be able to access that particular school within 10 minutes of walking distance. If I increase my travel threshold to, say, 20 minutes, my picture looks like this. So I see my accessibility has increased. If I'm able to walk 20 minutes, I'm able to access more number of schools, right? Or the schools are able to access more number of students on the flip side. But then if I go up to 30 minutes of transit, I see a very interesting picture beginning to emerge. So what I see is that the older, established, more economically advantaged areas of the city have much higher transit accessibility to the more rapidly growing greenfield, moderate income to lower income or socioeconomically disadvantaged areas of the city. So I still see pockets and clusters where people can, where there are areas of high accessibility, but there's a fairly nicely defined gradient which says that, the more economically resourced areas in the city have sort of much higher transit access to schools, and so we did this for schools as well as hospitals, and the general framework would allow the mapping of any kind of accessibility to any kind of social infrastructure. And now there's another interesting point that emerges. What about cars? So this is by transit. And again, one of our long-term planning vision, as well as in the short term, like thinking of sustainability and so on and so forth. We want to move towards transit oriented, accessibility oriented cities. We want to move away from car dependent cities, right? So this, on the other hand, is car accessibility. So this is data on the ground telling us that if I was to choose a bus or a train, my accessibility is way lower than if I was to just hop into my car to drop off my child at school, right? Because once I jump into a car, then the accessibility just goes up way, way, way high. And I should mention here, we are actually using big data sources to measure median speeds and times on every single road link all across Australia. So this is travel times being computed at weekday mornings, 8 a.m.s, when most people would be actually trying to access maybe dropping off their kids to school and then going off to work. So we are actually accessing very large data sources here, which actually compute the accessibility by computing travel times from one location to the other to a very high granularity of both spatial and temporal granularity. I started with the question of what is the data showing us, and if I was to just play this as a movie, well, this is pretty much what the data is showing us, that our transit accessibility needs to go way up higher, and if we want to move from essentially car-based cities to transit-based cities. And this is kind of like our overall results, and you would see that we went with Sydney and Brisbane and Perth. These were the three greater metropolitan areas that we studied. And what we did was we ended up comparing the priority growth areas of each of the greenfield priority growth areas in each of these. So it was Northwest Priority Growth Area for Sydney, Ripley and Yarra Bilba for Brisbane, and the Northwest Corridor for Greater Perth. And across all of the cities, what we pretty much found was that access to social infrastructure is significantly worse off and lagging behind in the priority growth areas than the greater capital city averages. Now, that's not very surprising, because one could really say that there is always a lag in the delivery of social infrastructure, because the way that our development scheduling is pattern is that our critical infrastructure goes in. So we have the sewer lines, we have the electricity grid, we have all of those critical services in there, and then we have residential development, and then social infrastructure kind of follows. But what these results were able to bring out in quite sharp focus was that if we had a much finer spatio-temporal track on how development is occurring, and development is inherently unruly and uneven and bursty, it happens in bursts in all of these outer areas of our cities, then if we were to track that very, very critically and very, very fine, in a very fine granularity way over space as well as time, then we could actually start to handle this lag in a much better way than we currently are able to do, right? So that, I think that was one of the key takeaway messages. So what was our pipeline, and in essence, what were we thinking, what were we exploring, that we were hoping that big data and the use of big data and development of all of these methods based on big data could help us achieve. So first, we were hoping that we would see a lot more evidence that could inform very rich planning decisions, right? The other thing that we discovered through our panel discussions with experts from all the three, we had local government experts and state government experts and policymakers and planners from all of the three states, and they came back to us with the feedback that often, the local government levels, the state government level, and the federal level, the communication, the coordination is very hard because there's no common data source and there's no common way to access decisions when they are being made at all these different levels. So communication and coordination and monitoring. And then finally, coming to plan evaluation, there's also this idea that if I'm able to track changes roughly in real time, then I can very quickly go back and evaluate whether I'm achieving the goals that I have stated in my plan. So we were hoping that this sort of academic research can then help inform evidence-based planning and improve coordination and communication and monitoring between and within the levels of government, and act as a planning tool as well as a plan evaluation tool. So some big goals there, but let's just jump in quickly. I know I have only 15 minutes, so I'll jump in quickly into the pipeline of what we actually did to compute those final maps that you saw. We had access to this really great data set, which is called Geoscape, and it essentially gives us the entire building footprint of Australia, right? And we thought that if that kind of very fine-grained data on dwellings construction activity is available to us, can we use it as a leading indicator of computing population growth at the small area level? So we tracked building activity through dwelling density computations based on the Geoscape dataset. Using that, we computed populations at the small area level. And using these projected populations, we were then able to compute accessibility maps specifically for these growing areas. And looking at the accessibility maps, we were able to compute then lead, lag, and deficit computation. So which areas are performing well, which areas need more focus, which areas are really poorly performing and need immediate attention. That sort of, hierarchical sort of ranking of areas. And then ultimately, as I said, we presented these findings to policymakers and planners at various levels of government to even explore whether something like this could lead to a useful tool that could have actual impact in the planning process. So I'll quickly show some snapshots. So this is what the Geoscape data looks like. This is 17 million buildings, each building more than 9 meters square of roof area is represented there exhaustively for the whole of Australia. And you can see zoom-ins of our three cities, Perth, Sydney, and Brisbane there. And it's an incredibly rich data set. You can see the academic in me going all nerdy and all excited because, that's what we love. We love data and we love kind of playing with it. But sorry about that. And then, so this was our buildings data set. Zooming in, you can see that this data set is available to us at every single quarter. So every single quarter, we can see at a very fine level how many dwellings have been constructed in which area, right down to the building footprint. And using these, so that's another screenshot from Marsden Park, and you can see exactly how many new houses were constructed between two time periods there. And you can basically track finest scale growth in built form using this. Using this, we could then aggregate the data to an arbitrary level. So basically, if say planning decisions have to be taken at various levels, LGAs, SA2s, SA3s, SA4, so we could go right down to the mesh block and then aggregate all the way up to whatever level was required. And so you could see that different areas have very different kinds of growth trajectories. So they're not all uniform, and that's also to be expected, but we could exactly track which areas are, showing activity when. And using that, we could use dwellings growth as a leading indicator for small area population projections. We have a very, very simple linear model in which, we were using this as an explanatory variable essentially to predict population growth. And using that, we then came back to the two questions I started with, that if this was to be my population distribution, what does my accessibility to social infrastructure look like? So with that, I think I would like to end by summarizing on some key takeaway messages. We found that outer suburbs and peripheries lag and perform poorly in providing timely access, but also this is exactly where most population growth is occurring most rapidly. So the areas that are lagging behind are exactly the areas where a huge number of people are moving in to live, right? And that is this sort of fine balance and contradiction between that's why this whole question of scheduling and delivery becomes so important, timely delivery of social infrastructure. And the methods can be used to evaluate the performance of socioeconomically disadvantaged areas. So obviously we were looking at the rapidly growing greenfield areas, but exactly the same set of methods could then be projected onto different parts of the city and say, okay, we want to look at, say, CIFA, the socioeconomic indicator for areas that the ABS has, and we could look at all of the low CIFA areas to compute deficits, needs, and requirements very specifically for the vulnerable areas of our cities. And then also exactly the same set of methods can be used to evaluate any infrastructural dimension. So this is really a cry out for more data being publicly available for planning purposes, whether it be locational data essentially for any kind of social infrastructure dimension. So I think that's like hugely important. Then having a common information base enables better coordination and planning between levels of government. And typically, when our land use and strategic planning happens in a different sort of organization to transport planning, obviously they're related, but I think the number of organizations that are involved in the delivery of social infrastructure and urban development altogether, using something like this could mean, I mean, this is a long-term goal. This is obviously like a huge amount of work has to go into actually test whether this can be realized. But the hope is that something like this could provide something like common information base. And then fine granularity, publicly available spatiotemporal data, and therefore the derived urban science and informatics methods is key to planning sustainable shock and trend resilient cities. This is really my cry out as an academic researcher for more publicly available data, more reliability of data, more accuracy, more granularity in terms of if we really want to aim for shock resilient cities that can quickly adapt to what is happening in real time, then having access to that data would be like I think fairly essential and key. And I think that is where I would like to end the presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Somwrita. We appreciate that very clear rundown of the report and the research that you and your team conducted and the conclusions that you found. I'd like to welcome onto the stage with me now our two panel members, Tanya Steinbeck, who is the CEO of the UDIA in Western Australia, and Alex Rhodes, who's the Executive Director for Regional Victoria at the Victorian Planning Authority. We're now going to have a quick response from both Tanya and Alex before we engage then in a panel discussion altogether. And once more, I remind you to please pop any questions that you may have for Somwrita or for Tanya or Alex, or indeed anyone on the panel into the Q&A, live Q&A tab. at the right of your screen. So first, let's hear from Tanya. Tanya, please, we invite you now to provide some remarks following that presentation of the research.
Thanks for that, Tom, and thanks for that, Somwrita. It's refreshing actually to see, I guess, the capability of what can be provided through the research that you've just presented there. I guess from what I'll talk about just very briefly is from a WA perspective, the role of the development industry in delivering social and community infrastructure and some of the challenges that we see facing us over here. And I think some of those challenges are consistently applied across the country. So I guess from WA's perspective, the role of delivering the vast majority of social and community infrastructure in greenfield areas falls to the development industry and the local government authorities, and they're typically funded by developer contribution schemes or DCPs, as we call them. So just to give you in context of the scale of investment in social and community infrastructure, just at a Perth and Peel level, currently there's around 54 DCPs active in the Perth and Peel region with a total value of just over $2 billion. So it's a massive investment that needs to be far better coordinated than it is currently. So ultimately, it's the home buyer that pays, and the one that also misses out when it takes too long to deliver the infrastructure. So there's numerous circumstances where we have buyers that end up moving out before they even get to benefit from the infrastructure that they have themselves contributed to as purchasing their house. So I guess if we start with the fundamentals, there's a real need that I see for accurate and regularly updated monitoring of housing supply and demand down to the LGA level. And to be able to do this, we really need a single source of truth on population forecasting, which at the moment is kind of all over the place. So our state government, they prefer Treasury forecasts from a WA perspective, but then we've got, Federal Centre for Population that have their forecasts, and then LGAs use a different source for their forecasts, and it's just all over the place. So we don't actually have a consistent single source of truth, which makes it very difficult then to accurately forecast what demand and supply it needs to look like, so that industry and the LGAs can respond effectively within the timeframes we need to make sure the social and community infrastructure is in place. So I guess there's a whole raft of issues that influence whether or not land that's zoned urban can actually be developed in the first place, including land fragmentation, environmental constraints that aren't currently taken into account by our state government's supply monitoring tool, which is called Urban Growth Monitor. So what the perception is here that there's plenty of zoned land to facilitate a population of 3.5 million. And from some research that UBIA and its members have done, we've just taken one small component of the southeast corridor of Perth, and we're seeing some significant issues in those assumptions. So what we're trying to do here is get to a point where state and local government and the industry are all on the same page when it comes to the assumptions that sit behind the monitoring of housing supply and demand here. And so from an infrastructure coordination and delivery perspective, we have recently got the establishment of Infrastructure WA here, which we're a bit behind some of the other states, and seen the draft state infrastructure strategy released here in WA. The challenge for social and community infrastructure in its vast majority in a greenfields context, it falls outside the mandate of Infrastructure WA because the individual value of the pieces of infrastructure that we're delivering are under $100 million. So whilst collectively $2 billion is a huge sum, the individual infrastructure items don't fall within a sort of the purview of an IWA body. So at the moment that sits with the Department of Planning. And so it's it's all a bit of a hodgepodge at the moment. The administration of the schemes and the plans are inconsistent across different local government authorities, and so we're in the process of getting a revised state planning policy to help assist at streamlining the delivery of social and community infrastructure, and also to be mindful of cost escalation over time, and how that influences the timeliness of delivering these pieces of infrastructure. So in our view, infrastructure that's funded by developers should be addressed in a comprehensive delivery program that's committed to by the LGAs, and informed by development rate forecasts and cash flow projections. And at the moment, that's not necessarily the case. And again, I think it comes back to not having that data set, not having that consistent view of demand and supply. Oversight and intervention as well is needed to resolve infrastructure delivery delays, and or excess accumulation of contributions without any firm commitment to actually deliver the piece of infrastructure at a local government level. So we're pushing for an independent administrator of DCPs here in WA to make sure that the cost and timeframe disputes are resolved quickly, so that the home buyer gets to benefit from the infrastructure that they've been promised. But I guess in summary, we desperately need that single source of truth. And it needs to be done in a collaborative way. We need all parties that are involved in the delivery of funding and delivery of social and community infrastructure to be on the same page in terms of what those assumptions look like, where the data comes from, and then commit to using that consistently moving forward, so that we don't end up in disputes with different local government authorities in where, how, why we deliver certain pieces of infrastructure.
Thanks, Tanya, for those thoughts. And I now ask Alex Rhodes to step forward and present her remarks as well.
Thank you, Tom. Hello everybody. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country today, and in my role I commit to care for country. The Victorian Planning Authority is a unique authority that was created by the government. We are the state government strategic planner. So what does that mean? So VPA, we have not only the planning toolkit, but we also have the funding available to us, and we have a predetermined pipeline of precinct structure plan areas that we actually work on in outer growth areas. So how is it that we have the toolkit? What's in our toolkit? The first critical difference is that we have a lead role in planning for those areas because we are made the planning authority by the Minister for Planning. The important part of that is we have the authority to do the plan, but also because we're part of government, it means that we're having the conversations with the state agencies around the table. So a large part of the role that we play is actually coordinating state government inputs to those strategic plans, as well as working in partnership with the council for that structure plan area. In terms of the funding, the projects themselves, in order to do the strategic plan, that is actually funded by third-party funding, so the landowners contribute to that. How do we actually do planning for social infrastructure? There's a couple of things that is quite advantageous to what we do. So the first one is that we have a very clear lean process and timeframes for planning for social infrastructure, which enables us to do just-in-time delivery. So the process starts with we run all projects through some eligibility criteria. And those eligibility criteria help us determine what gets on the work program, but it also ensures that what's on our work program can actually be achieved in a 3-year time frame. So we look for barriers that might prevent us from, whether it's policy or strategy or it's provision of other major pieces of infrastructure work, but we look for things that might actually hold us up by 12 or 24 months, which would mean that we wouldn't actually start that project. Or on the flip side, we have criteria that deal with whether supporting infrastructure has been contributed by state budget. We have a very, very clear time frame for doing a structure plan, which is 3 years. As soon as we hit the go button, those state agencies know that they need to deliver and work with us in partnership to deliver the plans within that 3-year time frame. But it also helps with the just-in-time delivery. The process also involves those state agencies right up front. We call it front-loading the issues. So they're part of the co-design of the plan so that we can actually understand what the barriers, the planning barriers might be that we actually need to focus on and escalate through the process. So to give you an example of that, if you look at state infrastructure, for example, with schools, we work very, very closely with the Department of Education to plan for primary and secondary schools. So between us, we have a combination of using data. So we will look at the state government's population growth data, but we also use the Department of Education's enrolments data, because that will help us determine the location of those schools. We also work with Catholic Education that actually own land, so it's a different relationship, but as a landowner, they're actually part of the process to determine where schools will be located. With local infrastructure, picking up on Tanya's point about DCP, so we have an infrastructure contributions system in Victoria, which again, that part of the plan, the work is done by the VPA. So we identify all the items in consultation with stakeholders. It's very much based on nexus and need. Is it basic and essential? Is it equitable and accountable? But the system itself, it can very clearly identify eligible items. So for example, community infrastructure items like multi-purpose community centres, kindies and so on. It also has a very clear and transparent way of costing those items, so that we end up with a precinct infrastructure plan and a very clear costing plan that actually goes with the infrastructure contributions plan. So the other thing to pick up on Tanya's point about shared data and metrics, we have PSP guidelines. We've just updated them recently. They've been on consultation. We're about to launch them. They've had input from every state department and councils. And so we have a clear set of metrics in those PSP guidelines that the VPA can use in terms of its allocations of social infrastructure in a precinct structure plan. So that certainly goes a long way to having a shared understanding of what infrastructure is required for a community from those very early years of when it's first being designed and planned.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate those thoughts from you and that very quick explanation, I guess, of the VPA and how things work for Melbourne and the growth areas there. We've got time now for a panel discussion between the four of us. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you've got to say to each other and in response to a range of questions that we'll put. But I guess I'll just observe, first of all, we've got a researcher, we've got someone representing industry, and we've got someone representing government. So we've got a good mix on the panel today. So please do send in questions that people can engage with. Not that I obviously want to box anybody into any stereotype of those three categories. I'm sure you'll all have a lot to say across a range of issues. I'm going to kick off by, I guess, referring back to a couple of things we heard earlier today. Actually, we had a session just before lunch about population mobility. That obviously there's been quite drastic changes to the population profiles and population mobility and dynamics nationally as a direct result of the COVID pandemic and the closed international and often state borders. and just how that's impacted on the ways that people are living and working and so forth. In the discussion that we had in that session, there was some interesting things that came to light from the people on that panel around, I guess, these questions of data, and also about communication between different state agencies, but also communication between different levels of government. And what we learned from the people from, senior people from Brisbane and from Melbourne in that conversation, who I guess drew our attention to the fact that there is a much more fluid level of interaction occurring post-pandemic between different levels of government, much more frequent and slightly less formalised engagement. Also, a different attitude to data was what emerged from that conversation too, that rather than a kind of slower and a real concern about, I guess, the quality of data, a willingness to, because of the need to respond very quickly to things changing on the ground, a real openness, I guess, to getting data from a much broader range of sources than hitherto, and needing to engage with data that, perhaps wasn't necessarily as good quality as the kind of data that we were used to dealing with. I guess I want to bring some of that into this conversation here. Is that in terms of infrastructure planning, particularly social infrastructure planning in our growth areas, and in relation to, I guess, also the kind of data that Somwrita presented that was used for her research, are we seeing an openness to getting, in order to respond more quickly, an openness to getting data from a wider range of sources? And I'm saying that in mindful also, Tanya, that you said you're looking for that one source of truth. Obviously, having data from lots of sources throws up some issues too. But can we have a bit of a discussion around, I guess, data, where it's coming from? Is it good enough? Has the pandemic actually changed our attitude to data? Is that your experience in your roles?
I'll kick it off, Tom. I think that we, in state government, we've certainly been looking at data before COVID. And government has definitely been moving more towards sharing of data and sharing of information. So an example of that would be in Victoria is that the VPA has been responsible for a work program we deal with, for example, the outer Melbourne growth areas. So just because you're doing a small structure plan for a particular area, you're still taking into consideration planning matters that deal with the whole catchment. And what we found was that it wasn't only about catchments, but in some instances, particularly when you start talking about public transport, you needed to start thinking about things in a corridor context. So we've actually found that in our discussions with state agencies, we're now moving towards sharing that data and actually planning for corridors. Now, the advantage of that has been that we are starting to overlay our data sets, but it also means that at all levels of our organisations, we're actually coming to the table and having the conversations and having the realisations and the understandings of the implications. If you turn the dial in one part of Victoria, the impact that it has on other parts of Victoria. What's also important about that is it also raises, if you start to look at a region in a corridor context, that's when you can start to bring in social infrastructure, which is traditionally led by the Commonwealth. And again, that's where you can actually start to do some thinking about where is the next big hospital going to go, and you can actually involve the Commonwealth in those discussions. So I think that COVID has just accelerated the need for this and perhaps increased the uptake of using digital data, but we were definitely focused on it before.
Tanya, do you have anything to say on that issue?
Yeah, well, I guess from WA's perspective, we haven't probably experienced COVID like the other states. And so I think where I've seen the greatest impact was in when COVID first hit. There was an enormous gathering of I guess goodwill amongst the government and industry and everybody to pull together to make sure that we had the legislation in place. We were able to keep the economy going, keep jobs going, all of that sort of thing. So I think where I've seen the greatest impact is from legislation that would normally take years getting pushed through in 3 months. Like, it just absolutely phenomenal time frame. So that to me proves that if you want to get something done quickly, the government can do it if they have the resources. That's sort of where I've seen the greatest impact. But from a data perspective, there's been a lot of talk in WA for a long time around open source data, particularly from government, using government data better. But I don't think we've yet kind of cracked it. And we've got a proposal here in play from Landgate, which is our sort of state title administrator, to establish a platform called Spatial WA. So they already have the cadastral data. They have a whole range of data sets and geospatial data, all of that sort of thing. So what Landgate are wanting to do is basically set up a single platform that all government agencies can use to better plan for infrastructure, supply, all of those sorts of things across the state. So it's a really ambitious project. It's at least 10 years away. They're still working on, the business case, significant investment that's required. So I think that concept has broad support in general. I guess the skeptic in me, having worked in state government as well, is there seems to be a reluctance to share data because of the power that comes along with withholding information. And so there's a cultural kind of thing that sits underneath it within siloed government agencies that, and I saw this in various different agency contexts at various levels of privacy and associated issues with sharing data, that we also have to get the commitment at a sort of senior government cabinet level to instruct agencies to open up and to actively want to share that data, because it's been challenging historically to do that. So I think the intent is there. Do I think COVID has made that more of an imperative? Probably not so much in WA, just because, it hasn't impacted us like it has in the rest of the states. But from a legislative perspective, yes, we're speeding things through just to keep the economy going. But from a data side, I don't think we've really seen a huge shift.
Somrita, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, I think Tanya's comments are an excellent segue into one. Okay, I'm going to say it's a rather provocative idea, but I do think that along with all of the government, the public side, there is a huge role to be played by very large private organizations who hold a lot of data collected from the people, so every time we use our mobile phone, we are giving away our trajectories literally. And of course, so we've seen recently in the time of COVID examples like Google community mobility reports, the Apple community mobility reports, which go down to the LGA level and specify exactly on every dimension, on retail, access to workplace, playgrounds, recreations, how much has things changed from the baseline. I'm sure many of us would have seen that, right? So essentially, what I'm trying to say is that very large private organizations hold very, very large, reliable, accurate sets of data, but they also have a public responsibility. And so if there is a chance for government to work with, kind of hold the organizations like Google responsible and say that they also have a public role to play, then a lot of that data can actually be one of those new sources of data that you were referring to, because this is data that is at census level granularity, but is kind of ongoing and continuous. It's not once every 5 years, it's every single day, right? So every time we log into Google Maps, we can see how congested a road is and what route should I take, right?
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to kind of provocatively open up that space and say that all that data should, I'm not saying all of it, there are privacy concerns, there are ethical concerns, but I'm sure that things can be negotiated so that they can, at least part of that could be used for public purposes.
Thanks, Somwrita. I'm going to use that to segue to, I guess, pick up on one of the questions that our audience has asked, and also link that to a conversation I was having with Alex yesterday, which is obviously we've started this conversation talking about social infrastructure. We're talking about the buildings, the provision of things like schools, hospitals, that kind of thing. But social infrastructure also relies on services as well, and it's not just the building; it's also the service associated with social needs and the needs of a community. Linking that to a question that we've got here, which because the research that you presented was looking at, I guess that was very spatial. It was looking at that spatial provision. How can that kind of how can big data and you just referred then to that how Google Maps, for example, will use that in terms of live traffic. How can that kind of big data be used, or can it be used in terms of, I guess, that finer grain of service delivery? So not just about where should the hospital be, but health provision of health services within a community, that kind of thing. I might jump to Alex on that, and then back to you, Somwrita, as well.
Thanks, Tom. Look, to kick it off, the social service supply chain is incredibly complex. So at the VPA, we've tried to deal with one end of that spectrum. So the starting point is we understand that a new suburb, I kind of liken it to a child. When a new suburb is created, and from the day the first spade goes in the ground to when families move in and they're looking for a school to be, it's like your early years. It's the 0 to 5 years of childhood. With social services, you need those from the very beginning, particularly if you've got young families moving in. And the challenge is, where do they go and what can they afford? And we have debated this with private sector and with councils. And where we landed, and it comes to a couple of points that both yourself, Somwrita, and Tanya have raised, is we actually needed a metric to understand what is the minimum floor space that's required to provide social services in a brand new community. It sounds very simple, but it's actually, if we can understand what the minimum amount of floor space is that's required, then what we can actually do is to start to have discussions with both developers and councils to say, it's a bit like the metrics in the guidelines, but can you look to allocate a certain amount of floor square area where you will either provide that at a peppercorn rent or it's low rent, and then at least those social services providers know that there is a space there that they can afford. And that then has a big impact on their ability to actually go get funding secured and to be able to then locate into that new community. So that's one part of what we've looked at to deal with that particular issue. The other one is, so with schools, similarly, we've found that with the Department of Education here in Victoria, they've just recently released their standards and guidelines for the delivery or the requirements of schools in both greenfield areas and for urban renewal areas. And that, again, is actually a very big step, an important move in terms of understanding the land take that's required to actually deliver a school in a new community, as well as what's the land that's required in an urban renewal area. It's slightly more complicated in an urban renewal area because what you're dealing with is you've got a number of existing schools. You know, you have to follow population patterns and the flow of population, and you usually find that in urban renewal areas, your primary school enrolments can go up or down depending on, I mean, we're in a COVID environment now. For example, Victoria, we used to see 60,000 overseas migrants come into Victoria every year, and that fell off a cliff 2 years ago. But it will eventually ratchet back up. So it's a very, you need to understand how social services operate, how they get funded, how they then work out the catchments where they need to go. And I think, you know, to pick up on your points, Somwrita, I think that the social services sector actually need a lot of assistance to help them deliver what they deliver best that we know that's needed. Because at the moment they're operating as individual not-for-profit organisations and aren't necessarily connecting up their own data.
Somwrita?
Yeah, I mean, those are such excellent points, because I was also thinking as you were speaking, Alex, that we have this whole physical space requirement, and now in the cities of the future, a lot of access is simply going to be virtual. So instead of me going to a service, the service is going to come to me. So I'll have these. So already, you know, I have little robots coming to the doorstep with my Amazon delivery, or I have mobility as a service. I have all of these electric vehicles. I have these new forms of transport, and also there's this whole world where we can think of accessibility as a combination between physical accessibility and virtual accessibility. So the integrated accessibility is about, so in one of our design studios this semester, we are doing app development during COVID for people to access telehealth, because going to a doctor physically may or may not be as feasible. So what are some ways in which you could design ideas in which you could access healthcare without actually going into a physical space to access healthcare, right? So I think this whole question of how the virtual comes together with the physical, and how we think of integrated access rather than just physical access, or so I think that's the question, that facilities and services kind of come in an integrated whole together, and that's kind of the future of cities, really. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Thanks, Somwrita. To talk about a different form of integration now for a moment, we have a question here that's asking for the panel's view on the way that different tiers of government integrate, particularly in terms of funding for infrastructure. The questioner says that often local government has to then go and seek federal government funding for facilities, even though they're the ones providing those facilities in a state-based planning system. Are there better ways of doing that? Tanya, I might turn to you. You were talking a little bit about this before. What have you got to say on that issue?
Yeah, look, I think can it be done better? Absolutely. One of the challenges that we have, or our members have, and it's not some local governments are actually really skilled at going out and seeking funding from other sources outside developer contributions, and are very proactive in going and getting federal government funding or trying for state government funding, depending on what the piece of infrastructure is. Some of them are really proactive, others not so much, and so I think what we're trying to achieve is more integrated infrastructure planning and delivery at that sort of LGA level across the board. So from the funding to the contracting, procurement, delivery, the whole thing can be far better coordinated. And sort of reflecting back on what Alex was saying about at a corridor, looking at things at a corridor level. One of the things that we do see which needs to be better coordinated is different LGAs approaching federal government for funding for, say, regional level sporting infrastructure, as an example. But each council wants to have that piece of infrastructure in their LGA. And so you will have multiple LGAs that you only need one regional level, playing field within, a certain precinct. You don't need 3 LGAs having a regional sized piece of infrastructure in each. And so at that level, it's elevating the conversation and looking at infrastructure planning at a corridor level, and going, right, well, in the northeast corridor of Perth, for example, we need X number of regional playing fields, or we need, whatever it happens to be. And then coordinating the infrastructure, funding and delivery at that level, rather than having different LGAs competing for having that and owning that piece of infrastructure. So I think there's definitely work that can be done there, and it's really about having the state and local government and industry working together to identify what is required at a corridor level, and then what are the opportunities within that to seek federal funding, and make sure that we're not providing infrastructure for the sake of it. We're providing it, as it's needed in the right location. So yeah, I guess it can be better done for sure.
Alex, is that how the VPA does it? Do you see yourselves having that coordinating role between local and federal governments?
We sort of sit on the other side of some of the discussion. Those discussions with the federal government are generally led by state agencies.
Yeah.
But one of the things that's interesting in this post-COVID environment that we're in, and it's different around the country and around the world, but there is no doubt that as a result of what's been happening over the last 2 years, money is really tight. State budgets, federal budgets, they have all taken a massive hit. They have been very much how to keep countries running, economies moving, and sort of delivering, a whole raft of initiatives to support those that are impacted by COVID. So as a result of that, I think what we are starting to see, and I'm certainly seeing it in state government, is that there is many more shoulders to the wheel to understand, okay, moving forward over the next decade, we actually have to work together in order to find initiatives where we can actually focus in on the priorities, align where state funding goes, and really, really focus on, how do you deal with affordable and social, how do you deliver affordable social housing? How do you deal with, for example, in regional Victoria, workforce attraction to keep economies going? And how do you actually, deal with the next layer of social disadvantage that has developed whilst COVID has been very, very active in our communities over the last 2 years?
Thanks, Alex. Turning to a different question now, we've talked about, I guess, more built infrastructure, but green and blue infrastructure is an important part of an important resource for communities. And there's a question here that I guess highlights the fact that the difficulty or potentially the low valuation and the difficulty of valuing and financing that kind of infrastructure in new areas. It makes it difficult, I guess, to develop business cases and develop priorities. The questioner is suggesting this is a problem in many countries and is interested in the panel's views on this topic.
I'll kick it off on the business case front, because I'd be interested to know others' views. But it's really interesting when, with business cases, traditionally you do a cost-benefit analysis for delivery of infrastructure. And I think that has been a space in economics that has, always been determined in a certain way. I think as we, as our understanding of social issues, climate change, other matters start to, and also this post-COVID world where, the movement of populations has been quite dramatic at the moment. And I think that that's something that we need to look at because, for example, we've seen the movement of populations to the regions and we're all wondering, is this just a blip or are they going to come back to the cities? Those sorts of things need to be factored into cost-benefit analysis for certain pieces of infrastructure. So, as well as the role that property and uplift plays. So to give you an example, if you take the London Underground or the extension of the London Underground, when the cost-benefit analysis was first done for that, it failed. And even though you kind of look at it and you say, but, what about property values? Surely if you extend the rail, then you're going to see an increase in property values. But for some reason, the metrics didn't stack up. But then somebody thought about it a bit more and they added into that cost-benefit analysis the fact that rents were going to go up as well as the developments in those commercial properties in and around that route were actually going to be attracting a much larger workforce into the city who are actually going to bring economic benefit into the city. So there's something to be thought through in terms of cost-benefit analysis of those business cases.
Yeah, I'd probably follow on from what you're saying there, Alex. I think certainly what we've experienced here, and I'm sure you have, around the country, is when COVID hit, the importance of our green spaces and public open space, I think, have escalated beyond what it has been before. Yeah. People want to be able to get out of their properties for their 1 hour of exercise day and enjoy beautiful spaces. And so I think the focus now on being able to deliver that green infrastructure and particularly responding to climate change and, the urban heat effect and, all of these things, and we want to greater tree canopies and all of these sorts of things, is how do you quantify sometimes the unquantifiable when you are developing these business cases? How do you quantify the impact, the positive impact on mental and physical health when, that's a fundamental part of why we develop these amazing spaces. And so I guess, from a developer's perspective, part of what they're trying to deliver in creating a great community is spaces and places for people to recreate and enjoy with their families. And that's why they contribute. That's why we have DCPs. That's why, they want that infrastructure delivered up front. They don't want residents to have to wait, 5 or 10 years for the funding to catch up so that the LGA is not going to be out of pocket. And so, that whole scenario around having, a commitment to funding infrastructure in advance so that at the very least, people that are moving into these communities have the benefit of these spaces, particularly in a COVID environment, it becomes even more important. So, I guess for me, it comes back to, some of this stuff you can't necessarily quantify in a business case context. It's an investment, in society. So, I don't know. That's my view.
I think I'm going to jump in here and say that it's so much also like a design question and managing people's perceptions about density. So it's a clear trade-off, because if all of us want 5-bedroom homes, then we are trading off on the quality of common public open space. And then if we can think of innovative forms of, housing mixes and tenures and different types of so high density or medium density may not necessarily mean poor livability, right? So in terms, this is a big urban design and planning question, that is it possible to deliver quality green and blue infrastructure with quality housing, because again, that's kind of an integrated question, because there are trade-offs involved there. Because there's a density trade-off involved with the amount of space that's available to us, given a constraint on the total number of people who are in a city, right? So I think there's all kinds of interesting design and planning questions there as well. And it's actually been fascinating because from the academic perspective, we think of this as a scientific problem. Yeah. So we go around quantifying literally everything. You can quantify access, and you can quantify travel times, and you can quantify, footprints. Yeah. So I'll just quickly finish that. We kind of go about quantifying everything, but at the same time, I lost my train of thought.
That's okay. Somrita, thank you. I think we got that point. It was really good. I'd just like to thank you all because we're about to run out of time and the session will close on us. But thank you so much, all of you, for a really interesting discussion. We could have gone on a lot longer, but really appreciate what all of you have had to say. Please join us back here at 3:15 for the final part of the program.